Well, that was a very interesting session on extreme explorations, and it's very evident that we are just dipping our toes into what is out there. I'd now like to welcome you to this fireside chat in which we explore the undiscovered territory hidden underwater. I'm very happy to be introducing the host, Dr. Alan Leonardi, who is on the Schmidt Ocean Institute Advisory Board in his personal capacity. Alan is the director of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Office of Ocean Exploration and Research, which operates the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer, which, like the Falkor, transmits live dives from the ocean to a broad audience. Seafloor mapping in the US EEZ is a key component of his portfolio in this position, and he's been instrumental in crafting a plan to map the US EEZ deeper than 200 meters by 2030. Dr. Leonardi, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jodica, and thank you for having us in this chat here today, and for the leadership that the Schmidt Ocean Institute is showing in this arena. I'm excited to be here in a personal capacity to advance anything we can do in the ocean exploration, the ocean mapping arena, and I'm happy to be joined here with a couple of esteemed panelists and, of course, an esteemed keynote speaker. And I'll just jump right into it without belaboring things. And I'd like to introduce that keynote speaker, Mr. Jamie McMichael Phillips. Jamie is the Seabed 2030 project director, and he's worked in a range of leadership roles, from running his own marine data gathering missions to directing defense geospatial strategy and plans. Seabed 2030, as many of you know, is a collaborative project between the Nippon Foundation of Japan and the General Bathymetric Chart of the Oceans, aiming to bring together all available bathymetric data to produce the definitive map of the world ocean floor by 2030 and make it available to all, and hopefully in the process bring a little bit of competition to that wonderfully mapped planet of Mars. Jamie, are you ready to take it away from here?
Alan, thank you very much, and a huge thanks to the Schmidt Ocean Institute for making all this happen. So without further ado, distinguished attendees, ocean explorers and mapping professionals, I'm delighted to have been invited to speak to you this evening, or today I should say, and as part of this fireside chat session, the Undiscovered Territory Seafloor Mapping. As director of the Nippon Foundation JEBCO Seabed 2030 project, I'd like to take the opportunity to give you a little bit of history about the project, as well as providing an overview of where we are now and where we plan to be. I've been heading up the project since December 2019. Prior to that, I'd held senior roles in the Royal Navy, and from 2010 onwards, I'd worked for the United Kingdom Hydrographic Office, firstly as a Deputy National Hydrographer, and latterly as a Head of Partnering and Engagement in Asia Pacific. And during my time at the UK Hydrographic Office, I also chaired an International Hydrographic Organization working group, where I had the privilege of leading a team of intergovernmental experts who monitored and advised on global chart coverage for the safety of navigation. And it was whilst I was in those roles that I became much better acquainted with a passionate but not greatly publicized group of scientists, mapping professionals and explorers, and their project named the General Bathymetric Chart of the Ocean, or JEBCO for short. And of course, its focus on mapping the ocean floor. Now, there's a huge amount of rich history surrounding JEBCO, and I haven't got enough time to do it justice today, but suffice to say that it has its roots in the International Geographic Congress, which subsequently nominated a commission on suboceanic nomenclature that was convened in 1903 and was chaired by Prince Albert I of Monaco. And it was under Albert's leadership that the group worked to produce ever-improving versions of the JEBCO chart. On his death in 1922, responsibility for JEBCO transferred to the director of the Oceanographic Museum in Monaco, and subsequently to the International Hydrographic Bureau, which today is the headquarters of what is now the Secretariat of the International Hydrographic Organization. Fast forward a little bit more, and the IHO community came together with the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, IOC, of UNESCO to jointly manage the JEBCO project. And work in the 70s and 80s saw the publication of the 5th edition of the JEBCO chart. Now, the enthusiasm of all those involved in JEBCO has persevered over the years, with scientists and mapping professionals assembling data that has been donated by a huge global community. Much of that data has come from the same scientists and mappers, but also a great deal has come from mariners, engineers, hydrographers and explorers, all of whom have donated data. And indeed, as a young bridge watchkeeper and Cub hydrographic surveyor, I recall spending many hours gathering and preparing transit bathymetry to be sent off for use in GEBCO. And ultimately, when I progressed through the ranks and became in charge of my own safety of navigation surveys, particularly those in remote areas, ultimately the data from that made its way to GEBCO. But of course, we've got an enormous ocean, 362 million square miles, 37 times the size of the United States, and covering 3/4 of the Earth's surface. And we all know it's easy to map the dry parts, but we also all know that the laws of physics preclude the speedy capture of data in the deep oceans. So progress, while steady, is slow. Wendy already mentioned in her keynote address that we know more about the surface of Mars than we do our own planet. So a terrible indictment, really. But a huge step forward was made in mapping progress with a forum for the future of ocean floor mapping that was held in Monaco in 2016, attended by a mix of scientists, policymakers, public and private sector representatives. And in his keynote address, Mr. Yohei Sasakawa, the chairman of the Nippon Foundation, announced an initiative to partner with GEBCO to work collaboratively to achieving 100% of world ocean mapped by the year 2030. Why? To empower the world to make policy decisions, use the oceans sustainably, and undertake scientific research based on detailed bathymetry that hitherto was missing. So that work clearly complements UN Sustainable Development Goal 14. And that led to the formation of the Nippon Foundation GEBCO Seabed 2030 project and its mission to deliver the definitive bathymetric chart of the ocean by the year 2030, and to make it, crucially, to make it freely available in the form of the GEBCO map. So that had changed pretty quickly what had been perceived by many as a primarily academic project into a truly worldwide endeavor, with a mission to mobilize the world to fully map our oceans by the year 2030 for the benefit of humankind. And at the seabed launch in 2017, the GEBCO map only depicted 6% of the oceans mapped adequately. Spurred on by the vision, the strategy and the driving force of its founding leadership, the Nippon Foundation and GEBCO, the Seabed 2030 project team delivered the 2020 release last year, back in June, of the GEBCO map depicting 19% of the ocean floor map. So a significant increase in the short life of the project. And needless to say, back in 2016, when the forum was happening, I never imagined that a few years later, I'd be more actively supporting GEBCO by leading the Seabed 2030 project. But here I am, and I must say, I'm hugely impressed by what they, now we, have achieved so far, and I'm hugely eager about what lies ahead. So Seabed 2030 is truly a global partnership. GEBCO remains fully operational under the auspices of IHO and IOC, and is responsible for publishing the GEBCO map. And Seabed 2030 as a subordinate project is an accelerator to achieve the 2030 mission. In October 2019, the project hosted a prestigious event called the Vision to Action event at the Royal Society in London, attended by ocean scientists, maritime experts, international organizations and industry partners. All came together to hear about what was happening from the people leading mapping projects, to discuss challenges that have been faced so far, to share ideas, and to learn about the collaborative networks that were being sustained by Seabed 2030. But above all, to underline the global benefits, and most of us know them already, but others don't, of having a comprehensive, high-resolution seafloor map. Now, fast forward to today, the vision that was formed in Monaco provides a solid foundation and remains core to the heart of the Seabed 2030 project. We need to keep that initiative top of mind, particularly amongst policymakers, scientists, and other professionals, and in particular amongst the community upon whose data we gratefully rely. So Seabed 2030 has helped fill in some of the data gaps, and that's been thanks to generous donations of existing data sets from companies like Fugro and PGS, and as well as new data from partner organizations, including Caledonia Oceanic and our hosts here today, the Schmidt Ocean Institute. And indeed, we are hugely proud to be associated with the Schmidt Ocean Institute, and in particular, the work of research vessel Farkor, that gathered the first public seafloor data of 2021. And we all know, you hopefully people have seen the press release, but the onboard team literally pinged their way into the new year, gathering bathymetry at the stroke of midnight on the 31st of December and well into the new year. So Falkor also, and again, something we're very proud of, flew the first official flag of the Seabed 2030 project. And that marked the start of the UN Decade of Ocean Science. And we're essentially, the seafloor map is a fundamental layer within the UN Decade of Ocean Science for all the other science involved, that base layer. Now, the use of new technologies, uncrewed surface vessels, satellite-derived bathymetry for shallow waters has accelerated mapping progress. And crowdsourced bathymetry is also giving us a tremendous boost. There are countless vessels, from container ships to pleasure craft, plying their trade every day at sea, all fitted or most fitted with echo sounders, and the ability to continuously gather and add new data sets in appropriate water depths, of course, to be used by GEBCO. The organization, Seabed 2030 organization, has developed steadily. The team consists of 26 people, not all full-time, across 7 international locations and 5 centers. And in terms of concrete achievements, over the past 5 years, well, at the start of Seabed 2013, 2017, as I mentioned before, the grid stood at 6%. Today, based on recent statistics that we've calculated, we are now at almost 20%. And I must say that is a pretty impressive accomplishment in those few years that the project's been running. So looking ahead, what will be the main points of focus over the coming years? Well, first of all, we need to keep building the links and strengthening the connections between the private sector, localized seabed mapping initiatives, shipping companies, academia, and governments. The project itself is a relatively small initiative, only 27 people, as I mentioned, but the networks and partnerships it can build have huge potential for impact. Secondly, and a topic close to my heart, Seabed 2030 has responsibility to bring the community of mapping professionals together, if not in person at the moment, then at least virtually, not just amongst GEBCO and not just amongst our own talented ocean mapping alumni, but much more widely. There is much untapped experience out there, and bringing professionals together from all around the world will help us build those networks, will give us a better view of existing mapping projects that are in place, and also help stimulate new mapping initiatives and, crucially, new technologies. And of course, in achieving all that will underscore the huge value to humanity of achieving a fully mapped ocean. And thirdly, a focus on crowdsourcing. That should become a normal part of everyday activity at sea. Switching on the echo sounder to generate new data should become embedded in everyday bridge routine. The COVID pandemic's made it a little harder to build networks and bring the community together, but there are plenty of options and opportunities for us to stay in touch, and we've seen that over this last year. This webinar, this symposium is an excellent example. The fireside chat session, when focused on seabed mapping, will help influence the future of ocean mapping, GEBCO, the Seabed 2030 project, and spark new ideas, and maybe even attract professionals from outside our existing circles. So we've got a decade, or just under a decade, to make it all happen by 2030. And the next 10 years, I'm absolutely sure, will be equally as exciting as the first 5 years of the Seabed 2030 journey, not least because the UN Decade of Ocean Science has just started. And of course, its end coincides with the deadline for the Seabed 2030 mission. Undoubtedly, new technologies will need to be absorbed by us all. The impact of uncrewed or lightly crewed vessels on larger scale mapping in uncharted territories will continue to grow, I hope. Crowdsourced bathymetry will become an established form of data gathering. The private sector will hopefully help us to drive that trend. And of course, we shouldn't forget people outside the marine community, the general public, who will gain an even better understanding and appreciation of the importance of the oceans in their everyday lives. So it's my privilege to be steering the ship that is the Nippon Foundation GEBCO Seabed 2030 project and into the new decade. If nothing else, and it's been clear to me that the scientists and other professionals involved in the project are living proof that the passionate pursuit of a common goal, in this case seabed mapping, can have huge impact. Seabed 2030 is paying dividends, not to shareholders, but to everybody, from the private sector to governments and ultimately to humanity as a whole. So I'd like to finish by encouraging all of you to think about new ways to spread the word, to help us extend our Seabed 2030 community, and to not just to ocean mapping professionals, but way beyond that. So enough from me. Hopefully there's some time for questions, and so back to Alan. Sorry.
Jamie, thank you. Wonderful, wonderful walkthrough over 100 years of history, from the beginning days to what's happening today that we're all here celebrating and will continue to celebrate over the next decade. We've got time for a few questions from the audience. Leonard Pace from the Schmidt Ocean Institute is going to help feed a couple of those to me. And as soon as I've got a question, I'll go ahead and ask you if you're ready, Jamie. Let me ask you something, Jamie. What do you think is the biggest challenge we're going to face in actually meeting this 2030 goal?
Well, we're at 20% today, and a lot of that has been based on us acquiring and assembling and synthesizing existing data. The huge challenge is going to be going out there and mapping the ocean frontiers, gathering that remaining 80%. I think, you know, depending on how you analyze it, we're talking of the order of about $5 billion worth of effort by traditional surveying means. Of course, uncrewed autonomous technology will drive that down, but it's in many respects is not a huge amount. It is less than a couple of missions to Mars, but we need to bring those communities together. We need to mobilize mapping efforts. We need to increase those that are out there already working on science projects, who perhaps don't normally think about gathering bathymetry, and getting that into the GEBCO grid. The GEBCO grid's always been reliant on a huge amount of donation, and we'd like to see that continue, and wherever we can, look at how we can perhaps match donors to science missions and increase that acceleration of mapping.
A daunting task, indeed. We do have a couple of questions coming in now. And this one really, I think, is kind of a combo, two separate questions that I'll put into one for you. First is, how do we inspire people to share their existing mapping data with the project, or the things they're going to be collecting? And then on the more public engagement side of that, do you think that MR, VR, and AR could help engage the public in meaningful ways?
I guess the challenge of sharing data reaches across all sectors. You know, is there an academic embargo on the data because a group of people need to write science papers, and therefore we can't access the data straight away? Are there national security aspects as a commercial confidentiality? The bottom line is we're not asking for hugely high resolution data. You know, at best, we're looking for one bathymetric sounding in a 100-meter grid in shallow water. So a sounding in the area the size of a football pitch, out to a 400 by 400 meter grid in deeper water. We need that's the sort of scale of effort that we need. So if we can encourage people to take their data, to grid it, to sanitize it, to strip out the huge amount of detail, then actually we can encourage them to share. Because ultimately, you know, the decade has started. Seabed mapping is fundamental to all that science, and we need to deliver.
Fantastic, Jamie. One last question, and then we'll let you off the hook. A couple questions coming in regarding uncrewed and autonomous systems. Interested in knowing what you think, how important they'll be in achieving the 100% goal by 2030. And part of that question is that you've got systems coming online now, like the Saildrone Surveyor, a project near and dear to my heart, but they're not yet established. And so what kind of a pacing and a phasing do you think this is going to be for uncrewed and autonomous systems?
I mean, between now and 2030, there's going to be a blend of traditional shipborne crewed platforms, and as that autonomous or lightly crewed or uncrewed technology accelerates, then I can see that becoming neck and neck initially, and perhaps overtaking traditional means. We've had a huge success, albeit on a very small scale, of using uncrewed technology. People will be familiar with the Shale Ocean Discovery X Prize and the JEDCO Nippon Foundation entry, the CKIT, which won first prize. That's now been operationalized. It participated in August last year in a transatlantic trial to test over-the-horizon controls using satellite. We were lucky enough to be able to borrow the sonar system. We had hoped to put our sonar operators in the ops room in the UK. COVID stopped that. So we ended up with 12 individuals across 8 countries using Microsoft Teams to remotely operate the sonar system, having first mission planned, and then to process the data afterwards. So uncrewed technology is going to be a great game changer for us.
Indeed, I tend to agree. I think it's at the very least going to be a nice force multiplier, but we've got to get them up and fully operational and deployed as much as we can. So, Jamie, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your comments. I hope you stick around for the rest of the session and the rest of the symposium. And with that, I'm gonna jump into what we're calling a fireside chat. I've got a couple of people joining me for this. We've got Vicky Farini. Vicky is a senior research scientist at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, Columbia University. She's also an affiliate associate professor at the Center for Coastal Ocean Mapping at the University of New Hampshire. She's chair of JEDCO's Subcommittee on Regional Undersea Mapping and is the center head for Seabed 2030's Atlantic and Indian Oceans Regional Centers. While I don't know how she has time for research, her interests do include bathymetric mapping throughout the global oceans and making marine geoscience research data publicly available and easily accessible to scientists and the public. We also have Dr. Robin Beeman, who's a research fellow at James Cook University's College of Science and Engineering, where his research interests include hydrographic surveying and digital elevation modeling. He's involved with AusSeabed, a national seabed mapping coordination program, and has expertise in compiling large 3D depth models for Australian waters. Welcome, Vicky, and welcome, Rob. I'm glad you're here with us today. I'm going to jump right in with a question to get us going, but feel free to riff on this in different directions as if this was a high school debate. You all have sailed on the Schmidt Ocean Institute research vessel Falkor, the same vessel that rung in the decade by collecting the first mapping data to support the UN decade. What's the most unexpected or exciting thing you found at sea, especially as it may relate to mapping?
Vicky, are you maybe you can unmute?
Well, I wasn't sure if you wanted to go first, if you wanted me to go first. I'll go first because I think maybe I sailed earlier. I was on the Falkor in 2016 doing some hydrothermal vent work with a interdisciplinary team, including Pete Gerges, who was in the previous session. And we had some bad weather and we were unable to continue our ROV work because of safety issues. So we serendipitously were able to go and acquire some data at a nearby volcanic island that had just formed. So it was at that time the Earth's newest landmass. We were the first to map it. The crew really stepped up and made sure that we could do it safely, and we collected absolutely spectacular data that fed into some studies that NASA was doing about Martian landscapes. So the capabilities of the Falkor, the willingness of the crew, and also of my colleagues in the science party really all made that happen. It was really just spectacular.
Fantastic, Vicky. Always good to be there when it's the first new landform rather than the dissolution of the last landform on the planet, I would suppose. So, Rob, what about you?
Yeah, I'll go back a little bit further because I've been in the ocean mapping game for about 25 years or more. Not so much the new seafloor like Vicky experienced, but old seafloor, but interestingly so close to where I live, which is in northeast Australia off the Great Barrier Reef. It's an area that I grew up in. And for, through the 90s, I was actually a hydrographic surveyor in the Royal Australian Navy, but mainly focused on shallow water shelf systems. Then in 2007, I was an academic and I was on board Australia's ocean mapping vessel, then the Southern Surveyor, and we were actually mapping drowned reefs off the edge of the Great Barrier Reef, very poorly understood, in depths of around 100-ish meters. The vessel couldn't work at night time in those shallow waters. And so the very first night we decided to plan mapping offshore on the continental slope, and our very first multi-beam line exposed submarine canyons, the like of which I'd never seen before. And it was such a revelation to think that probably only about 60 kilometers from where I am now, that these had not been mapped, certainly not in any detail. It was multi-beam sonar that actually needed to reveal that. It was like Vicky's, it was serendipitous, but it has spawned huge amounts of research, lots of student projects. We've done a lot of papers on this. We've now mapped well over 100 submarine canyons, and certainly in the last year with the Falkor, we've continued mapping further north, exposing more of these canyons. It's just a remarkable landscape.
Indeed, and it's hard to believe that there could be so many mysteries that are around every corner in the ocean, particularly in the deep ocean domain. So it's positive that we've got so many people that are focused on these days. You said you've been in this field for 25 years or so, and Vicky, you've been around for a while. We know that this isn't a new field. Ocean mapping has been around for a very, very long time, but we've seen tremendous advances in this field in the last 50 to 70 years, some of which are, of course, brought about by technological advances and techniques that are pushing the scientific area forward rapidly. As I think about the 2030 challenge and more broadly, also about exploring the ocean domain, if there was one technological advancement you could have for mapping the oceans, what do you think it would be? What would be on the top of your wish list?
Vicky, you're very close to this, being so involved with the GEPCO 2030 project. So maybe you'd like to start with that.
Yeah, sure. It's already sort of happening, right? So more autonomy, but not just with data acquisition, but also with respect to data crunching. I spend much more of my time focused on the sort of downstream end of things, catching the data, integrating it, working it up. And there's a lot of manual labor that is still required to do that. There's some techniques that are coming along, but the kind that will actually be able to bring together the entire global data set of raw data and be able to operate on it to produce products on demand in the 5 to 10 year time frame, that's what I have my eye on.
Wow, fantastic. Rob?
Yeah, I'd like to nominate a few because I kind of work at both ends, both the collection and also the data processing and then delivery to the public. I see some real big challenges. Number one, and we've touched on it, autonomous surface vessels. I think if we are really serious about mapping this vast ocean, particularly as I think the mean depth of the ocean is around 3,900 meters, we can't really rely on human-powered, traditional vessels. We really need to scale up, bring autonomous surface vessels, not the smaller ones that tend to work on the shelf, but big hull, deep ocean vessels. Imagine a large barge with a gondola and a 12 kilohertz multi-beam system. It would, have a fleet of them working, mapping the seafloor 24/7, not having people on board. I think that would be quite a really huge advance in the amount of seafloor being mapped. The other big, for me, it's another big challenge is technology transfer to the public. It is still a real challenge for people, the general public, non-experts, to be able to access this data. I'm talking beyond the scope of experts who are quite familiar with GIS and the like, but to be able to share the public in ways that they can really engage with. And I think Catherine Ball asked the question, can augmented reality, virtual reality, things like that really help? And I definitely think so. We need to take the technology away from specialist software that people need to install. I think things like 3D point cloud visualization using WebGL, basically just zooming, flowing through the data on your browser is very, very easy and has, I think, a lot of potential. And one last thing, Jamie mentions crowdsourced bathymetry. We actually run a project here in the Great Barrier Reef doing that. It has its own challenges, huge potential. We've collected over 60,000 line kilometres in the last year. So I'm really encouraged by where crowdsourced bathymetry is going.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think you're touching upon a couple of things that are coming in on the question stream as well. And maybe I'll just jump in there for a moment since it's related. One, there is a question about whether or not gamification or app development would help with some of this data. The terminology was used as the Grand Theft Auto for underwater. Right today, games are worth more than movies, and so maybe that's a movement in the future. Do either of you have any thoughts on whether gamification and app development might help in this arena?
I mean, there's certainly been conversations about that in terms of the data processing and data cleaning. And I think anything that we can do to engage people in this really exciting work is something that's worth pursuing. I think that the way to bring the data together and get it cleaned and what I was talking about before, really working toward algorithms that can do a better job and take this sort of subjectivity out of it is really important, and also versioning of data products and all that. But I think in general, and with technology in general, everything that we can bring to bear for this kind of a challenge is A, necessary, and B, we're going to discover all kinds of things just because of the technology that comes out of this.
Indeed. Rob, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I often talk about the visualization as when video games really took off, probably in the late 90s and sort of early 2000s as video game cards started to develop. And of course, the visualization tools that we had access to matched those things. So when I get a new computer, I look at the specs of the video card before I even think about RAM and all the rest. So certainly it's paralleled. And, as people are getting more and more comfortable with 3D visualization, but more, if we take it further to the mobile devices, this is mainly the tools that people are using. So if we can take it away from, big desktop kind of software that people can view and experience, the seafloor, fly through the seafloor on their mobile phone, I think that would be wonderful to see. And for me, it's always a challenge to actually share the data. And the simpler we can make this for people, the better. And if we go down the game path, then so much the better.
Yeah, fantastic. So like a VR version of Pokemon Go for the deep ocean and the seabed, right?
Exactly.
Can I add one other thing to that?
Please, Vicky. Please.
I think, part of what we're seeing right now technologically is we're evolving as a science community and data consumers to the model where we're bringing people to the data, right? The data is in the cloud. We can bring people there. We no longer have bandwidth limitations or local compute limitations. And once we sort of make that transition more holistically, there's going to be just an explosion of what's possible.
But we'll need some tools in the cloud for people to be able to work those things, right?
Yeah, there's huge opportunity for tool development there.
Yeah, similarly, and when you talk about bringing people to the data, Rob, you also talked about bringing kind of volunteers to bring data to the cloud as well, right? And one of the challenges I think you have with some of those things, as well as just pure transit mapping, is how do you handle the complexities of marine scientific permitting, right? I mean, you could be transiting through somebody else's EEZ. You, of course, are aware of work that's happening. What challenges do you see around that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And permitting here on the Great Barrier Reef, you cannot do any kind of research, including collecting just crowdsourced bathymetry, without a research permit. Again, it comes back to education with officials and the like, that the importance of collecting bathymetry data. Generally, when you explain the importance and how it can be used in research and management, the barriers fall away. But still, permitting, certainly in coastal state waters, is a challenge. But if I use Australian government as an example, while permits are required, they're very encouraging of foreign research vessels. Falcor is a classic example. Coming into Australian waters, it's a foreign research vessel, but those permits were made available for those vessels because the data is shared. It's shared with the coastal states and ultimately with the world through GEBCO and the like. So it can be overcome. It is a bit of an education exercise though.
Indeed.
So I could also add that I think in the context of Seabed 2030 and GEBCO, this is a place where the International Hydrographic Organization and the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission can really help us get the message out there and help us learn and educate and really encourage more data sharing and more data acquisition.
Yeah, thanks, Vicki. And Jamie, I see you nodding. If you felt like you wanted to make a comment, please join in.
No, I just really, Vicky's right. We shouldn't be doing this alone as a project or as individual mappers in institutions. This is why the partnerships, the power of the community, the power of that movement in ocean mapping is hugely important. And we've got to rely on, particularly if there is government data that is involved, then the IOC and the IHO are key to trying to help us free that up.
Yeah,
Can I just add something there?
Yeah.
So we actually, in research permits, we always mention the GEBCO 2030 project, the global effort that's being done. And so even though while it's a local effort within a small area in one part of, say, Australia's waters, we always mention the GEBCO 2030 project. People understand that it's for this bigger picture, so this bigger effort. So it's that message is definitely getting across there.
Yeah, I think it's important to reinforce that continuously. The other aspect of things that I think is interesting, and certainly some in the audience have commented on, is when we're out there running these ships or eventually fleets of autonomous craft, we never want to lose any of the data, and we want to use and distribute as much of it as possible. So there's several questions, about how we handle things like backscatter and how we can use bathymetric maps to help support our information for habitat suitability modeling and things like that nature that really require measures of slope or rugosity and things like that. And what do you see as the distinct opportunities in our continuing efforts with Seabed 2030, as well as potentially some of the challenges in these areas, particularly given two things: one, the volumes of data that we're talking about, and two, you can't always get this information from those voluntary sources who are providing the data because they may not be collecting it or saving it. So what do you think are the opportunities and challenges?
So I think that, if we were approaching Seabed 2030 from the perspective of just the resolution goals that we have for the project, we would be really limiting our capacity to grow and adapt to emerging needs and emerging technologies. Within the GEBCO community, the IHO Data Center for Digital Bathymetry has been available as the authoritative sort of international archive for all deep water bathymetry. It's been operated by NOAA for 30 years, I think, or so. And if we can actually, as a global community, embrace the model of putting all of the raw data in public archives, whether that be the IHO repository or other ones that can all be connected, the data goes in and then everyone has access to it. It's not just going to build the GEBCO product. And so that's one really important thread that I think is worth recognizing and emphasizing, because we're not just building this map for now, we're building the community of practice and the data volumes for the future. And that we can do higher resolution, we can extract backscatter, we can come up with new innovative ways of building products, as long as we actually preserve and make available all the data.
And if I might have a follow on, do some of those products include the ability of having things like services such as WMS map layers and things of that nature that are going to make this much more easily ingestible, particularly for third-party web-based applications?
Yeah, those exist. They might be a little bit hard to find, but they're definitely out there. GEBCO puts out web map services. The DCDB puts out web map services of the GEBCO product as well. So it's out there. Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. Rob, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, these Seabed map is really just the first start of all this work. We, speaking for myself, we don't just map for mapping's sake. We're using it for all kinds of science. And so for us, just having that map allows us to start doing, spatial analysis, slope analysis and like, which can be done very, very quickly. But you have to start with that 3D dimensional map of the seafloor, and then all of those other data streams analyses can flow from that. So just as Vicky said, let's start with that 3D map, make it as complete as possible, and then we can do all of that seafloor characterization, which relates to habitat mapping and the like, value adding to the original bathymetry map to start with.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Rob. I'm noted here that we have got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to keep us rolling. There was a question that I wanted to ask each of you, and Jamie, feel free to add as well. Every scientist I know, or at least nearly every scientist I know, has a story for how they got into their field and their heroes, both modern day and historical, that they look up to. Do you have any specific heroes you look up to in the field of seabed mapping, or a particular interesting story about how you came to be a part of this community? I don't know if you want to start, Rob or Vicky, either one.
Or
I know Vicky's got a story.
Well, I grew up on the Great Barrier Reef. I've spent my childhood snorkeling off beautiful coral reefs. They're still beautiful today. But I always spent, I looked down into the depths, beyond the limit of visibility and wondered what was down there. But as an adult, I found myself in the Navy, crisscrossing the world's oceans. As a watchkeeper, Jamie, I have been in your shoes, and we use these nautical charts covered in dots, broken contours and the occasional spot depth. And I was always curious as to what was down there. But really, it wasn't until the 90s that I really got into it, because we were surveying. I was up in Papua New Guinea. It was a quiet night, moonlit night. I was the only one on the bridge at the time. The seafloor was flat, and our echo sounder started showing a live volcano erupting thousands of meters below us. But in the profile, you could see the ash, the color, the sonar color of a live volcano. And I walked out on the bridge wing. Seafloor was completely still. It was all happening below me. There was all this activity. In the morning, as the sun rose, the sea was covered in a raft of pumice from horizon to horizon. We'd just gone over a really significant volcanic event. I was absolutely taken with what is down there. But it was really only until the advent, the real uptake of multi-beam sonar that brought living color and detail to the seafloor. And I've just been addicted to it ever since. I love looking at it. I love going out to sea on the Falkor. And anyway.
That's a great story. Hopefully you didn't spill your coffee when that sonar started pinging like crazy, right? Vicky, what about you? Any heroes?
Yeah, sure. Just as a parallel background, I grew up on the beaches of Cape Cod, and that I had a similar experience of wanting to see under the water. So for me, landing at Lamont, which is actually where I learned about Marie Tharp, which is pretty late in my career, and actually landing in a really inspiring group at Lamont that was working on putting together global bathymetry. So Marie Tharp is certainly a huge inspiration, the way that she transformed the way that bathymetry data was presented, from contour maps to her physiographic diagrams, and how she used her understanding of geology to sort of stylize profiles and really build these incredible visualizations that are consistent, remarkably consistent with much, much more data, what we see from much, much more data. So she's a huge inspiration, but I have to say that the continuity that I feel to Marie Tharp through Bill Ryan, who is still active at Lamont, is another really important thread. And a lot of his work that he worked side by side with her, and he carried things, and he sort of led and was instrumental in a lot of the digital evolution of things, and laid the foundation for a lot of the work that I do at Lamont. So he's definitely an ongoing hero for me.
Indeed, and a hero for many, as well as Marie Tharp. And shameless plug for one of our follow-on sessions. That's as much science as art, and so I encourage everybody to pay attention to the art session later on today. We've been taking questions from the audience all along. We've got a little bit of time left. I'll take another couple of questions. There's two here that kind of deal with a similar topic. One is just a pure question about how many nations are actually contributing data to Seabed 2030 today. And in other words, how many have extensive bathy, and that's either going into it or potentially those that aren't putting into it? And are there ways to encourage any other nations to substantially contribute as well?
I think counting the numbers quite difficult because, and I'm going to probably defer some of this to Vicky, but quite a lot of bathymetry comes to us from consortia. So collaborations like eModNet and the like. So it's not always obvious, but we're working on how we acknowledge those hugely valuable contributions. And I might just deflect some of that to Vicky, and I'll come back if we can't answer everything.
So I think that when we did the event in London in 2019, by my best count, it was somewhere on the order of 40 countries. And I'm sure that is an underestimate compared to where we are right now, but it's a lot. And one of the challenges to what Jamie was describing with respect to really crediting everyone is that there are so many layers of people and organizations that should be credited, because so much work is put in and so many resources are put into acquiring the data, putting the systems on, calibrating them, processing the data, integrating. So it's a multi-layered attribution kind of process that we're still trying to comb through, but it's increasing every year, and it's wonderful to see the momentum take off.
Indeed. Any thoughts from you, Rob?
Yes, attribution is important. You must give credit where credit is due, and particularly with crowdsourced bathymetry, for instance, where these vessels, even smaller vessels, are thousands of dollars a day to run, and so as part of our own crowdsourced bathymetry project, we're constantly showing gratefulness to the people that are providing it, but also giving them feedback. It's important to show that people who are contributing data, not necessarily experts, can see the results of their data. So it encourages them to contribute more. Yes, it is this ongoing effort to give credit where credit is due. It's not easy online, particularly, in Vicky's case, with GEPCO 2030, it's 30 plus nations. But, in fact, if we just say, the broader humanity, thank you very much. If we get to 2030 and we see what we've got, thousands and thousands of people who have contributed. It's a wonderful project, and yes, we have to acknowledge everyone in some way.
Yeah, and I think that takes me to kind of one last question as we wrap up and give people a break before the next session. Obviously, Seabed 2030 is happening today, and the goal of completely mapping the seabed by 2030 is truly audacious. It is truly a modern day moonshot, and it's going to take an all of the above approach, all of the communities, all of the assets, all of the capabilities we can muster. We can debate whether we'll be able to accomplish it. I think we can. Either way, I'm interested maybe in a sentence or so in knowing what you think the most lasting or impactful aspect of the effort will be well beyond 2030.
So this is an easy one for me because I say it all the time. I think that the community that we're developing that learns how to work together productively, recognizes the limitations, but still brings everyone to the table, this will have the longest lasting impact.
Fantastic. Rob?
Yeah, totally agree. It's the social networks that have been built up through GEPCO 2030 project. I see that as the hub. We have all these nodes, different countries, different groups. Certainly in Australia, we have the AusSeabed group. It's bringing together all different people from defence, industry, academia. We haven't really talked before until the last few years. So I think it's the social networks that will be sustained long after the GEPCO 2030 project is completed.
And Jamie, I'll certainly ask you if you want to comment. I think you would just say here to both of those things.
I'm going to say here, and this is really what GEPCO is all about and has been all about since it started in 1903. It's bringing people together, and with that focus of benefiting everybody involved, humanity, not just the science community, not just governments, but everybody.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Jamie, for your keynote speech, Vicky, for Rob, for joining us here. I think that this last commentary is really important. It's really the social networks and the social fabric that keeps us going. given the many things around the world that may be divisively pulling us apart, let's keep building these social networks and let's get this job done. I'm excited to be working here with you and with the Schmidt-Ocean Institute, and I appreciate they're inviting us to share a little bit of this symposium time with all of the audience. Thank you all for participating.